The day wore a gentle amber light, the kind that arrives when fall begins surrendering to winter, and the sun seems weary yet generous. It was among those afternoons where the breeze held barely a whisper of coldness, yet the brightness streaming through the glass bathed everything in a warm golden embrace. I stood beside the basin, cuffs turned back, completing the final breakfast plates that had mysteriously remained until the middle of the day. The heated water, the delicate aroma of citrus cleanser, the steady tap of pottery meeting metal, these small ceremonies steadied me more than I ever voiced aloud. That's when the sound reached me, rubber meeting gravel, moving deliberately along our entrance path. Initially, it seemed unremarkable. Our lane stayed peaceful, though occasionally a postal van or someone's vehicle would drift through. Yet something about this specific noise drew my attention upward. Beyond the window, I watched an automobile arrive and halt beside the entrance steps. Recognizable, though not something I witnessed daily. My spouse, Daniel, had referenced earlier that week how his colleague might appear, eventually carrying documents and agreements. No fixed appointment, he'd mentioned offhandedly while fastening his collar that dawn. If he arrives, he arrives. No need to prepare. He's uncomplicated. And apparently, eventually meant this afternoon. The vehicle door swung wide and out emerged Adrian. I'd encountered him numerous times previously, primarily at corporate meals, seasonal celebrations, and the rare charitable function where partners received polite invitations but weren't genuinely required near the workplace. From Daniel's descriptions, Adrian possessed a standing for maintaining composure, being reflective, dependable in ways that settled others. Face to face, he moved with understated assurance, never boisterous, never aggressive, but with the sort of naturalness that made you reflexively comfortable when he entered a space. I patted my palms against a cotton cloth and observed as Daniel pushed open the main entrance and welcomed him. Their clasp held that wordless chronicle within it, a touch more pressure, a mutual chuckle, a closeness suggesting they'd weathered lengthy conferences and challenging negotiations side by side. As they traded humor on the threshold, their amusement drifted softly toward the kitchen area, blending with the subtle drone of the cooling unit and the rhythmic wall timepiece. I chose to approach them midway, as was my custom. I placed several biscuits I'd prepared earlier onto a dish and filled chilled beverages into tall containers, steadying everything upon a serving board. When I stepped into the main chamber, they'd already positioned themselves, the daylight angling across the seating and illuminating the border of the mounted photographs along the surface. Our children during younger years, journeys, celebrations, all the typical instances we'd preserved permanently. Adrian rotated when he detected my footsteps. His expression radiated warmth, openness, the variety that touched his eye and caused them to fold gently at the edges. "Pleasant aromas here," he commented easily. "I'm assuming I arrived on an ideal afternoon." I responded with laughter and positioned the board upon the center table. "Simply something I assembled earlier," I answered, despite having invested considerable effort perfecting that biscuit formula months prior. "Please take what you'd like." Initially, the discussion flowed easily and expectedly. Employment matters, forthcoming ventures, a customer who had suddenly reconsidered their proposition. I attended as they conversed. Daniel, energetic and focused. Adrian, more deliberate, contributing observations steadily and precisely. I'd absorbed fragments of their exchanges previously, always from afar, and it impressed me again how naturally they complemented one another. Then Daniel's device vibrated. He examined the display and exhaled. "I must answer this. It's the distributor from Chicago, and avoiding him creates anxiety." He rose, lifting the device toward his face. "Returning shortly," he announced, acknowledging us both before vanishing along the corridor toward his workspace. The dwelling eased into a more subdued cadence, as though the atmosphere itself had relaxed. Momentarily, Adrian and I simply absorbed the distant murmur of Daniel's conversation in the background, the cooling unit's hum, the rhythmic wall timepiece. I chose to extend toward my container, resisting the peculiar consciousness that suddenly we occupied the space alone. He surveyed slowly throughout the chamber, genuinely observing it how visitors seldom do. His attention paused on the books arranged precisely on the shelving, the modest greenery on the ledge, the family images. He didn't hurry to occupy the silence, and strangely, that rendered it less uncomfortable. "You know," he stated softly, "I didn't grow up in serene places resembling this." There was no theatrical interruption, no weighted stress, yet his words settled among us with surprising substance. I watched him more intently, recognizing that something profound was emerging. "My father," he proceeded, "was someone of rules more than love. The dwelling was perpetually orderly, rigid, predictable, not in the reassuring way, more like if you ventured beyond the boundary, you'd experience it."
His vision lowered toward the container in his grasp. He maintained that gentleness rendered people fragile, so we were motivated to display strength perpetually. His voice didn't waver, yet there existed a strand of something delicate woven throughout it, vulnerability, contained yet visible. "I departed as quickly as possible," he continued, "university, then employment. Municipality after municipality, position after position, attempting to demonstrate something to myself or to him, perhaps both." He inhaled deeply, releasing it gradually. People consistently assume traveling for employment sounds thrilling, but there's a specific variety of isolation that accompanies never completely belonging anywhere. You discover to maintain portions of yourself concealed simply to remain upright. I discovered myself leaning slightly forward, my palms folded loosely in my position. I hadn't anticipated anything resembling this. I'd perpetually positioned him in a precise, small classification in my thoughts. Daniel's colleague, capable and pleasant, agreeable to be near. That was where the narrative had concluded. Now abruptly it felt as though an entrance had opened. "I'm regretful," I expressed gently. "That sounds burdensome to transport. That much pressure, so young?" He lifted his shoulders softly, though it wasn't a rejection motion, more like acceptance. "You adapt to it," he stated, "or minimally you believe you do. You cultivate this character, dependable, steady, the individual who can manage anything. People appreciate that. They trust it. But it doesn't leave substantial space for being anything else." There was no self-sympathy in his tone, only a genuine observation, the variety you form after years of contemplating things through quietly. I paused momentarily before speaking. It felt unusual to encounter such openness with quietness. "My mother departed several years ago," I stated, the phrases arriving more naturally than I'd anticipated. "She was the gentlest individual in the chamber wherever she went, the one everyone turned toward because they understood she'd attend. When she departed, people were considerate. They brought blossoms and prepared meals. They expressed all the appropriate phrases. But it was in the weeks afterward that the genuine emptiness established itself. The manner her absence appeared in miniature things. An unoccupied seat at the surface, a formula I couldn't quite duplicate, instances where I instinctively extended for the device and then remembered. Adrian's vision met mine, and it felt as though he genuinely perceived what I was expressing, not simply the surface of the narrative. "I believe that's why I maintain routines," I proceeded quietly. "Plates, cultivation, small ceremonies, they provide structure to the spaces loss leaves behind." He acknowledged, a gentle understanding in his demeanor. "I never discovered how to be proficient with loss," he confessed. "With my father, it wasn't something we discussed. When his mother departed, he simply said, 'That's existence,' and returned to work the following day. I think a part of me confused being strong with closing down. The silence that followed wasn't thick or uncomfortable. It was gentle, almost sheltering. Two individuals positioned in a sunlit chamber, acknowledging the burden of being human. The sound of Daniel's footsteps returning interrupted the instant, but in a manner that felt natural, not invasive. As he re-entered the main chamber, Adrian directed me a small, almost imperceptible expression, the variety that communicates, appreciation for hearing that. I reciprocated it with a faint acknowledgement, feeling strangely revealed, yet surprisingly settled. The remainder of the visit unfolded naturally. They returned to examining figures and agreements, and I drifted back to the periphery, refilling containers, presenting more refreshments, adding small remarks here and there. But under everything, something had changed. I no longer perceived Adrian solely as my spouse's colleague. I perceived him as an individual transporting his own chronicle, his own unspoken narratives. Later, when he entered his automobile and reversed from our entrance path, the atmosphere was beginning to flush with the subdued colors of early evening. As I watched the vehicle vanish along the quiet lane, a warm, contemplative stillness settled around me. I hadn't anticipated that variety of honesty from him. I hadn't anticipated to share any of my own either, yet I felt lighter somehow, as though a small invisible opening had been created in a room I didn't realize had grown airless. In the days that followed, life resumed its familiar rhythm. Mornings with warm beverages at the cooking surface, chores, errands, laundry, Daniel's time constraints and business conversations. But underneath everything, there was a subtle shift in the way I moved through my days. I found myself noticing things more distinctly. The way the sunlight glided across the floor around mid-morning, the way the foliage scraped softly against the windows when the wind strengthened, the particular quiet of the dwelling in the early afternoon. Every so often, my thoughts drifted back to that interaction, not to analyze it precisely, but to remain with it. The way his voice had softened when he discussed always needing to be strong, the way it had felt to speak honestly about my mother without having to minimize it for someone else's ease. A week later, one evening after the meal, Daniel mentioned casually, "By the way, Adrian might arrive Friday. There's some documentation we need to complete. Don't feel like you must attend closely. We'll probably just occupy the eating surface." I tried to respond casually. "Of course, I'll ensure it's available for you." But internally, there was a combination of something I couldn't immediately identify, hesitation and curiosity woven together. A part of me wondered if that first exchange had been a singular opening, something created by chance and timing, never to be repeated. Another part of me wanted to understand more about the individual who had positioned themselves on our seating and quietly revealed pieces of his inner life. Friday arrived under a covering of heavy clouds. The atmosphere was a dull gray, the variety that makes every color seem slightly subdued. I positioned a container of fresh blossoms, wild-looking ones with delicate petals and slender stems, on the eating surface, more from habit than intention. The dwelling hummed softly with its usual sounds, and as the timepiece edged toward late afternoon, I heard the now familiar compression of rubber in the entrance path again. Adrian stepped inside with a rush of cool atmosphere. He released a few scattered droplets of moisture clinging to his outer garment and immediately noticed the blossoms. "Those are beautiful," he stated genuinely. "They make the room feeling brighter than the atmosphere outside." I expressed mild surprise at how natural it felt to have him there again. "They're from the small market on the corner," I informed him. I couldn't resist them. Daniel welcomed him, and for a period, the two of them distributed papers and portable computers across the surface. Their discussion was focused, functional, rhythmic. I moved in and out of the room, refilling a container of fruit, supplementing their beverages, trying not to linger, but also not hurrying myself away. At one moment, Daniel's device illuminated on the surface with an incoming communication. He examined it, expressed slight displeasure, then exhaled. "I must take this. It's the construction manager on the storage facility renovation. He's impossible to reach otherwise." He gave us an apologetic expression. 2 minutes, he stated, though we both knew it would likely be longer, and stepped into the corridor. Once again, the dwelling eased into that softer quiet. This time the silence didn't feel uncertain. It felt familiar, almost anticipated, like an old companion who had returned and settled into the same seat it had occupied previously. Adrian leaned back slightly in his seat, letting his writing instrument rest on the surface. His vision drifted to the opening where a faint stripe of brightness had managed to break through the clouds, sufficient to cast a gentle illumination on the glass. I moved in a small municipality, not like this neighborhood precisely, more worn around the borders, but we had this little hill behind the dwelling. In winter, it felt as though the whole world contracted down to that hill
and a few dwellings.
I believe that's why I still notice the aroma of certain things, he stated. Cold atmosphere, baking bread, moist foliage. They remind me of instances when existence felt simple, even if everything else around it wasn't. It impressed me how gently he discussed his past, not glossing over the difficult portions, but also not letting them erase the positive ones. I spent summers at my grandparents' location by the water, I offered in exchange, the recollections rising easily now. The mornings always commenced in the cultivation area. My grandmother would hand me a small pair of shears and inform me which blossoms were ready to cut and which ones needed more time. I used to believe she had some variety of magical perception. Now I realize she simply paid very close attention. I expressed amusement at the recollection. The days there moved at a different velocity. We'd position ourselves on the platform and attend to birds for what felt like hours. I don't remember anything especially dramatic occurring, just a steady, peaceful variety of happiness. He observed me, an understanding warmth in his observation. It's amusing, he stated, how the older we develop, the more it's those varieties of recollections that stand out. Not the acknowledgments, not the advancements, just the quiet afternoons on platforms and the aromas from cooking areas. I believe those are the instances where we actually felt present, where there was nothing to perform, nothing to demonstrate, I responded. He paused, considering that, then acknowledged. I don't usually discuss my past, he confessed softly after a moment, even with companions. I'm not certain why it feels different with you. Perhaps because you actually attend, or perhaps because this dwelling reminds me of something I believed I'd outgrown. The honesty in his voice was steady, not theatrical, yet it still landed with a small impact in my chest. I'm pleased you feel you can, I stated. I don't take that lightly. There was a stillness that settled over the surface then, not empty, not tense, just a mutual recognition that something unspoken had been quietly acknowledged. By the time Daniel returned, apologizing more than necessary for taking so long, the atmosphere had shifted in an almost imperceptible manner. The documentation continued, the decisions were formed, signatures added. The practical tasks of the day resumed their rightful position. And yet, as we all eventually drifted toward the entrance to exchange farewells, Adrian's vision met mine with a quiet, grateful expression that didn't need phrases. That evening, after the plates were washed and the dwelling had settled into its nighttime hush, I positioned myself in the main chamber with a covering draped over my position and the lamp brightness softening the corners of the chamber. I contemplated honesty, about how rare it is for individuals to speak plainly about their inner existences, and how easily our days can pass in a blur of surface-level exchanges. We discussed the climate, about transportation, about tasks, but beneath all that, most of us are transporting narratives we rarely share. Weeks passed. Adrian visited again here and there, always for practical reasons, documents, strategy sessions, planning for forthcoming ventures. And yet each occasion, there seemed to be a small portion of the visit that drifted towards something more human than agreements and time constraints. One weekend, Daniel had to leave municipality for a conference. It was early Saturday dawn when he left, the atmosphere still pale and the lanes mostly empty. I accompanied him to the entrance, embraced him, observed him drive away, and remained on the threshold for an instant longer than necessary. The dwelling behind me felt unusually quiet, not isolated precisely, just still. I prepared a container of warm beverage, wrapped my palms around the heated vessel, and established myself on the front steps. The neighborhood was awakening gradually. Distant animals making sounds, an automobile starting somewhere, the faint trimming of someone's hedge device, the kind of ordinary soundtrack you don't notice until you're alone with it. The entrance signal rang unexpectedly. For an instant, I wondered if Daniel had forgotten something and returned, but when I opened the entrance, there was Adrian, standing on the threshold with a small paper container in his palms and a slightly uncertain expression on his face. "I was in the vicinity," he stated, offering a faint expression, "and there's this establishment that produces fresh loaves on Saturdays. I thought you might appreciate one." And naturally, Daniel referenced he'd be away this weekend, so he trailed off, as if reconsidering himself. "That's very considerate," I stated, genuinely touched. "Please enter. I was just positioned with warm beverage. We can share some while it's still warm." We moved to the main chamber and I divided the bread, letting the aroma fill the chamber. It was simple, crisp on the exterior, gentle on the interior, but somehow felt more than just nourishment. It felt like a quiet motion of care. We started with small discussion, the usual. The conference, the climate, a peculiar story in the news. But as the minutes stretched, something more thoughtful surfaced. "I've been thinking extensively lately," he stated, looking down at the portion of bread in his palms, though not genuinely perceiving it. I attended, my palms wrapped around my vessel. "In business," he proceeded, "you're expected to project confidence, stability. You're supposed to be unaffected. It's like putting on armor every dawn. But the older I develop, the more I realize how exhausting that can be and how isolated. You'd think being honest would be the simplest thing in the world, but it's not. Not the variety of honesty that communicates, 'I'm tired,' or 'I'm afraid,' or 'I don't always understand what I'm doing.' People communicate they want authenticity, but they're not always sure what to do with it when they communicate it." I acknowledged, feeling his words sink into my own experiences. I think we all have versions of ourselves we rotate through. There's the one we use with family, the one we wear at employment, the one we bring to social functions. We adjust, we smooth our borders, we minimize certain feelings because we don't want to inconvenience anyone. And then, late at night, when everything is quiet, the real questions finally arrive at the door. He released a quiet breath that was part amusement, part something else. "Precisely," he stated. "You start wondering which version of you is actually the real one, or if they all are, just in different proportions." We fell into a longer exchange, weaving through thoughts about identity and expectations, about the manner childhood structures our understanding of strength and vulnerability. He discussed times he'd wanted to communicate something honest in a meeting, but didn't, concerned it would be perceived as fragility. I discussed evenings when I'd felt unreasonably sorrowful for no obvious reason, then disciplined myself for it and buried it under tasks and inventories. There were pauses here and there, but none of them felt uncomfortable. They were the variety of pauses where the heart catches up with the expression, where you decide whether you're willing to continue a little deeper. By late afternoon, the bread was almost consumed, and the brightness outside had shifted into the softer tones of early evening. Adrian appeared more relaxed than I'd ever perceived him, his frame no longer carrying that faint, invisible tension. He stated, "I'm grateful for these exchanges. I don't take them for granted." "Neither do I responded. Not long after, Daniel returned from the conference, tired but energized in the manner he always was after days of connecting and demonstrations. That evening, the three of us had a meal together, one of those simple meals that somehow feels richer when there's an extra person at the table. There was laughter, there were stories, there was a gentle ease in the room that made everything feel a little more alive. The days transformed into weeks, the weeks into a new variety of normal. Adrian visited from occasion to occasion, always for practical reasons, documents, strategy sessions, planning for forthcoming ventures. And yet each occasion there seemed to be a small portion of the visit that drifted towards something more human than agreements and time constraints. One late afternoon, I was in the garden area, trimming back some excessive branches and coaxing the stubborn herbs into tidy lines. The atmosphere was streaked with gentle pastels, the air cool, but not cold. I heard a car pull in, then the muffled murmur of voices, and a few minutes later, Daniel stuck his head out the back door to inform me
Adrian had arrived. I patted my palms on my trousers and joined them inside. Adrian noticed the faint traces of earth on my wrists and fingers and expressed amusement. "Gardening day?" he inquired,